My name is Matthew. I'm 27 years old, and for most of my life, I lived in the shadow of my golden child sister Rebecca. While she basked in our parents' endless praise and support, I became the forgotten son. My achievements ignored, my dreams dismissed. The irony. Now the perfect daughter's perfect world is crumbling, and she's desperately begging for my help to save our family business from complete collapse. Before I get into my story, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt like the forgotten one in your family. Trust me, this story has quite the ending. I grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Chicago, in a house that my father Harold had renovated himself when he first started his construction company nearly 30 years ago. Our family wasn't wealthy at first, but my father's business grew steadily over the years, building a solid reputation for quality residential construction work throughout the Chicago area. My mother Diane managed the company finances and office operations, creating a true family business that my parents were immensely proud of. From my earliest memories, I recall the subtle differences in how my parents treated me compared to my sister Rebecca, who was 2 years younger than me. It wasn't anything dramatic at first. Just small things like my father's eyes lighting up a bit more when Rebecca entered a room, or my mother keeping Rebecca's finger paintings on the refrigerator for months while mine would disappear after a week. Despite this, I genuinely loved my sister. Rebecca was naturally charismatic, quick to smile, and seemed to understand people in a way that came less naturally to me. She was the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately make friends, while I was more reserved, preferring to observe before engaging. I admired these qualities in her even as I began to notice the growing disparity in our parents' attention. As we entered elementary school, the differences became more pronounced. I was a good student, consistently bringing home A's and B's, occasionally making the honor roll, and even winning the school science fair in 4th grade with a project on structural engineering. My parents attended the science fair, of course, but I remember my father checking his watch repeatedly, hurrying us along because Rebecca had a dance recital that same evening. They beamed with pride, watching her on stage, my science fair trophy, sitting forgotten in the car. Rebecca showed an early interest in our family business, often accompanying our father to job sites on weekends. By age 10, she could charm clients with her precocious understanding of construction terms, while I developed a passion for the design aspect, spending hours drawing buildings and studying architectural magazines. I would show my sketches to my father, hoping for approval, but was often met with a distracted nod and a quick, "That's nice, son," before he returned to whatever he was doing. My grandfather Thomas was different. My father's father had been a master carpenter before retiring, and he saw something in me that my parents missed. When I was 12, he started teaching me woodworking in his garage workshop, praising my attention to detail and steady hands. "You've got the eye of an architect and the hands of a craftsman," he would tell me, a rare form of validation that I clung to desperately. Those weekends with my grandfather became my sanctuary. At family gatherings, the pattern continued. Relatives would fuss over Rebecca, asking about her activities and achievements, while I would sit quietly, occasionally answering the obligatory, "How's school?" with a brief, "Fine," that satisfied their minimal curiosity about my life. My birthdays were modest affairs, while Rebecca's celebrations were elaborate events with dozens of friends and family members in attendance. As a teenager, I threw myself into academics and joined the track team, hoping that achievement might finally earn my parents' attention. I maintained a 4.0 GPA and even set a school record for the 800-meter run in my junior year. My parents attended one track meet that entire season, the one where Rebecca was volunteering at the concession stand for her community service credits. When I came home with my first place medal, my mother said, "That's wonderful, dear," before turning to Rebecca to discuss her upcoming class president speech. The most painful aspect wasn't that they favored Rebecca, it was that they didn't seem to realize they were doing it. They weren't malicious people, they simply had a blind spot when it came to their son. I developed a quiet determination to someday make them notice me, to force them to acknowledge my worth. I channeled this determination into my passion for architecture, spending countless hours studying building designs and creating increasingly sophisticated models and drawings. By the time I was applying for colleges, Rebecca was already being groomed to eventually take over the family business. At 16, she was attending client meetings with our father and offering surprisingly insightful suggestions about company operations. Meanwhile, I had set my sights on architecture programs, hoping to forge my own path while still finding a way to contribute to the family legacy. My relationship with Rebecca remained complicated but not hostile. She wasn't deliberately malicious. In fact, she occasionally tried to include me or highlight my achievements to our parents. But she had grown accustomed to being the center of attention, and naturally took up the space our parents so willingly gave her. I couldn't hate her for accepting what was so freely offered, but the resentment I felt toward my parents grew steadily with each overlooked accomplishment and each dismissive wave of my ideas. The summer before college applications were due, my grandfather passed away suddenly from a heart attack. It devastated me in ways I couldn't articulate. At the funeral, I stood stoic and silent, while Rebecca wept openly, receiving comforting hugs from relatives. I overheard an aunt say, "Poor Rebecca, she was always Thomas's favorite." The irony of that statement burned like acid. My grandfather had been my only true advocate in the family, and even in death, his special connection to me was erased and reassigned to my sister. Before he died, my grandfather had told me that the family home would someday be mine. "You'll appreciate its bones, its history," he had said. "You'll know how to honor its craftsmanship while bringing it into the future." It was the one thing I held on to as I prepared to leave for college. The promise of a place where I would finally belong. My acceptance letter from the University of Michigan's prestigious architecture program should have been a moment of family celebration. Instead, it became the first unmistakable betrayal. I still remember sitting at the kitchen table, letter in hand, as my father frowned at the tuition costs. "That's quite expensive, Matthew," he said, sliding the paper back to me. "You know we're putting a lot into the business right now. Maybe consider community college for a couple of years." This conversation occurred just 2 weeks after my parents had enthusiastically committed to funding Rebecca's education at Cornell's business school, a significantly more expensive proposition. When I pointed this out, my father became defensive. "Rebecca's education is an investment in the family business. She'll be bringing that knowledge directly back to help us grow." The message was clear: my dreams weren't worth investing in. That night, I applied for every scholarship I could find and began researching student loans. I was determined to attend Michigan with or without their support. Ultimately, I cobbled together enough financial aid to cover about half the costs, with federal and private loans making up the difference. To cover living expenses, I worked 20 hours a week at the campus bookstore and picked up summer construction jobs. Meanwhile, Rebecca sailed through her freshman year at Cornell, living in a comfortable off-campus apartment my parents paid for, with a generous monthly allowance. That meant she didn't need to work. During holiday breaks, dinner conversations revolved around Rebecca's exciting internship prospects and the valuable connections she was making. When I tried to share my own accomplishments, making the dean's list, being selected for a competitive design workshop, I was met with cursory congratulations before the conversation inevitably swung back to Rebecca. Despite these difficulties, I thrived academically. Architecture consumed me, offering both creative fulfillment and technical challenges that kept my mind occupied and away from family disappointments. My professors recognized my talent, particularly my ability to blend innovative design with practical construction knowledge, a skill directly informed by growing up around my father's business. Professor Langford, my design studio teacher, became a mentor, encouraging me to submit my work to student competitions and introducing me to working architects during department events. By junior year, I had developed a small but tight-knit circle of friends who understood me in ways my family never had. James and Tyler were fellow architecture students who appreciated my detailed technical drawings, while Emma, from my English elective, became a close confidant. Most importantly, I met Amanda in my urban planning class, a brilliant, warm-hearted environmental science major who saw me completely and loved what she saw. For the first time, I experienced what it felt like to be someone's priority. The most devastating moment came during my third year. I had been selected as one of 3 students nationally to receive the Hammond Award for Innovative Residential Design, a prestigious honor that included a cash prize and publication in Architectural Review. The award ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday in April, and despite our complicated relationship, I invited my parents, desperately hoping this achievement might finally be significant enough to matter to them. "We'll try to make it," my mother said, when I called with the news. Her voice lacking the enthusiasm I'd heard when Rebecca had received a much smaller departmental award at Cornell. "Your father has a lot going on with the business, but we'll see." The day of the ceremony arrived, and I stood alone on the stage, accepting my award, scanning the audience for faces that weren't there. Later that evening, I received a brief text from my mother, "Congratulations on your award. Sorry we couldn't make it. Rebecca's business school was hosting a networking event with some major Chicago developers, and your father thought it was crucial to attend to support her making industry connections." I remember sitting on the steps outside the auditorium, award certificate in hand, feeling a strange sense of clarity through the pain. I had achieved something significant, something that might actually help our family business if they could see past their favoritism, and they had chosen once again to prioritize Rebecca's more tenuous opportunity. Amanda found me there and sat silently beside me, her hand in mine. "They don't deserve you," she said finally, "and someday they'll realize that." My graduation approached with a mixture of pride and dread. I would be receiving my degree with highest honors, having maintained a near-perfect GPA while working part-time throughout my college years. My thesis project on sustainable urban housing had won the department's top prize and had even attracted attention from several Chicago-based firms. My parents and Rebecca attended the graduation ceremony, arriving late and leaving immediately afterward for a business dinner. There were no graduation gifts, no celebration dinner for my achievement, just a quick handshake from my father and a distracted hug from my mother before they hurried off. Rebecca, to her credit, seemed embarrassed by their behavior and texted me later to congratulate me properly. Despite everything, I made the decision to return to Chicago after graduation. I had received job offers from firms in Boston and Seattle, but something in me still yearned for my family's approval. I accepted a position with Hammond & Associates, a respected Chicago architectural firm specializing in commercial buildings, hoping that proximity might somehow heal the growing rift between us. Looking back, I realize I was setting myself up for the next, even more painful betrayal. But at 22, fresh out of college, and still carrying the hope that my family might eventually see my worth, I couldn't yet bring myself to cut ties completely. My return to Chicago was filled with cautious optimism. Hammond & Associates was located downtown, just a 20-minute drive from my parents' home in the suburbs, and I initially moved back into my old bedroom to save money while paying down my student loans. I hoped that living under the same roof again might help my parents see the man I had become. Accomplished, dedicated, and eager to contribute my expertise to the family legacy. The first few months were awkward but not unbearable. I quickly distinguished myself at the firm, impressing senior architects with my technical knowledge and innovative approaches to sustainable design. Within 6 months, I was assigned to assist on a major commercial project for a tech company, expanding their Chicago offices. My salary was modest, but growing, and I finally had professional validation that my skills were valuable. Meanwhile, Rebecca had returned from Cornell with her MBA and was immediately installed as the Vice President of Business Development at our family's construction company. My father had even added her name to the company letterhead, Wilson and Daughter Construction. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was the one who had spent years studying buildings, while Rebecca had studied business. Yet she was positioned as the company's future. Still, I made earnest attempts to bridge the gap. Over Sunday dinners, I cautiously suggested ways my architectural expertise could benefit the family business via sustainable design concepts that would differentiate them in the market, energy-efficient building techniques that could save costs long-term, even contacts at my firm, who could partner on larger projects. "We don't need fancy designs, just practical buildings," my father dismissed, barely looking up from his plate. "Our clients want function, not architectural showpieces." "But Dad, the market is changing," I tried to explain. "Sustainable design isn't just aesthetic, it's practical, cost-effective, long-term, and increasingly, what clients are demanding." "Matthew, when you've been in this business, as long as I have, you'll understand what actually works," he replied definitively before turning to Rebecca. "Now tell me more about that developer you met last week." I watched as my sister outlined her plans to transition the company from residential construction to high-end commercial development, a risky move that would require significant capital investment and connections our small family business didn't have. Rather than expressing caution, my father nodded enthusiastically, completely captivated by Rebecca's vision. Despite the continuing disappointments at home, my personal life was flourishing. My relationship with Amanda had continued after college, with her finding a position as an environmental consultant in Chicago to be near me. After 2 years of dating, I proposed using money I had carefully saved from my architectural work. She said yes immediately, and for a moment my life felt perfectly aligned. The wedding planning, however, quickly became another painful reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. My parents offered a token contribution to our wedding expenses, $5,000, which they presented as exceptionally generous. Just 3 months later, they hosted an extravagant 25th anniversary party for the business, spending what I later learned was over $50,000 to impress clients and industry connections. The party featured Rebecca as the shining future of the company, with my father publicly announcing her promotion to executive vice president. I attended the party with Amanda, both of us uncomfortable as I was introduced repeatedly as our son, the architect, with no elaboration or interest. One of my father's colleagues, slightly drunk on expensive champagne, pulled me aside and said, "Must be tough, living in your sister's shadow, huh?" I smiled tightly and excused myself, finding Amanda and leaving early. The true betrayal came 6 months before our wedding. Through a chance conversation with my mother's sister, I discovered that my parents had remortgaged our family home, the home my grandfather had promised would someday be mine, to fund Rebecca's ambitious expansion plans for the Rebecca's ambitious business. They had taken out a loan of nearly $700,000 against the property to purchase land for a speculative development project Rebecca had pitched. When I confronted my father about this, his dismissive response cut deep. "It's our house, Matthew, not yours. Your grandfather may have said some things to you, but legally this property has always belonged to your mother and me. But you're risking everything," I argued. "This market is volatile, and Rebecca doesn't have the experience for a project this size." My father's face darkened. "That's enough. Rebecca understands business in ways you never have. She sees opportunities, while you only see problems. Maybe if you'd shown more interest in the family business, instead of drawing pictures of buildings, things would be different." The argument escalated, with years of suppressed feelings erupting. I outlined all the ways they had favored Rebecca, all the achievements they had ignored, all the support they had withheld. My mother stood silently by, my father occasionally trying to interject with platitudes about how they loved us both equally, but her actions had long spoken louder than her words. The final blow came when my father, red-faced and frustrated, finally spoke the truth as he saw it. "You've never understood our business, Matthew. Rebecca is our future. She always has been." I left that night, moving my remaining belongings to the apartment I shared with Amanda. The wedding plans continued, but my parents' attendance felt obligatory rather than celebratory. After the ceremony, which was beautiful despite the family tension, Amanda and I made a decision that would change the course of our lives. We would move to Seattle, where Amanda had been offered an excellent position with an environmental tension consulting firm, and where I could pursue architectural work focused on sustainable design without the shadow of family disappointment. I didn't tell my parents we were leaving until the arrangements were finalized. Their surprise seemed genuine, as if they couldn't comprehend why I would want to move thousands of miles away. Rebecca, to her credit, seemed distressed by my decision, asking if there was anything she could do to make me stay. But the damage was done, the patterns too established to break. It was time to build my own life free from the constant reminder of my secondary status in the family I'd been born into. As our plane took off from Chicago O'Hare, heading toward a new beginning in Seattle, I felt a complex mixture of grief, relief, and determination. I was 30 years old, newly married, and finally ready to define success on my own terms. Seattle welcomed us with its stunning mountain views and perpetual mist, a landscape as different from Chicago as our new life would be from our old one. We found a modest apartment in Fremont, a quirky neighborhood known for its artistic community and famous stone troll sculpture. The first few months were challenging, adjusting to a new city, finding our professional footing, and processing the emotional aftermath of essentially cutting ties with my family. Amanda adapted quickly, thriving in her new role, consulting with the city on environmental impact assessments for urban development projects. I, meanwhile, went through a period of uncertainty. The architecture firm I joined was progressive and well-respected, but I found myself hesitant in meetings, second-guessing my contributions, the lingering effect of years of having my ideas dismissed by my family. You need to stop seeing yourself through their eyes. Amanda told me one evening after I'd come home particularly discouraged. The architects here don't know Rebecca. They don't compare you to anyone. They just see your talent. Her words stayed with me, and gradually, I began to rebuild my professional confidence. The firm specialized in sustainable design, exactly the direction I had always wanted to pursue, but had been unable to fully explore in Chicago. My background in construction fundamentals, gleaned from growing up around my father's business, combined with my architectural training, gave me a unique perspective that my colleagues came to value. 8 months after our arrival, I was assigned as the project lead on the design of a mixed-use building in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. The client wanted something innovative, yet practical, environmentally conscious, but within a tight budget. It was exactly the kind of challenge I had been prepared for my entire life. The resulting design incorporated passive solar heating, rainwater collection systems, and locally sourced materials without sacrificing aesthetic appeal or functionality. When the project was completed 18 months later, it received local press coverage and an award from the Washington Sustainable Building Council. My firm's partners took notice, and I was promoted to senior architect with a substantial raise. Beyond professional success, Seattle offered us the chance to form friendships untainted by family dynamics. We met Alex and Jennifer, a graphic designer and teacher, at a neighborhood block party, and the four of us quickly became inseparable. They knew nothing of my family history, initially accepting me simply as Matthew the architect, not Matthew the less favored child. There was something profoundly healing about being known for my present rather than my past. 3 years into our Seattle life, Amanda discovered she was pregnant. The news filled me with both joy and terror. Joy at the prospect of starting our own family, terror at the responsibility of parenthood and the possibility of repeating harmful patterns. I spent hours reading parenting books particularly focused on raising children with equal attention and support, regardless of their natural inclinations or talents. "You're going to be an amazing father," Amanda assured me as we prepared the nursery. "Your awareness alone ensures you won't repeat your parents' mistakes." When our daughter Lily was born with her tiny fingers and curious eyes, I made a silent promise to her. She would always know she was valued exactly as she was. Whether she grew up to be an artist, an athlete, a scientist, or something, I couldn't even imagine her worth would never be conditional on fulfilling my expectations. As I held my daughter in those early days, I reflected on my own childhood and the complicated emotions I still carried. I hadn't spoken to my parents in nearly 2 years by then, with only occasional text exchanges with Rebecca on birthdays or holidays. Through distant relatives and social media, I gathered that the family business was expanding rapidly under Rebecca's direction, with glossy marketing materials showcasing high-end development projects throughout the Chicago area. From the outside, it appeared she was fulfilling every expectation my parents had placed on her. My own career continued its upward trajectory. By the time Lily turned 1, I had gained enough recognition and client connections to consider starting my own architectural consultancy. With Amanda's encouragement, I took the leap, specializing in sustainable, commercial, and residential design. The risk paid off beyond my expectations. Within 18 months, I had a growing client list that included 2 major tech companies and several progressive developers committed to green building practices. Financial security followed professional success. We purchased a beautiful craftsman home in Ballard with a view of Puget Sound and enough space for Amanda's parents to visit comfortably from Minnesota. We established college funds for Lily and built healthy retirement savings. For perhaps the first time in my life, I felt completely secure. Yet, despite this outer success, I occasionally found myself awake at night, thinking about my family in Chicago. Not with longing exactly, but with a complex mixture of emotions. Wondering if they ever thought about me, if they regretted the way things had unfolded, if they would even recognize the successful man I had become. Amanda understood these moments, holding me without trying to fix the unfixable wound of family estrangement. "It's okay to miss the family you wished you had," she would say. "That doesn't mean you should go back to the family that couldn't see you." 4 years passed in this way. building my business, raising Lily, creating a life filled with purpose and joy in Seattle. I had largely made peace with my past, focusing on the family we were creating rather than the one I had left behind. Until one ordinary Tuesday evening in October when my phone rang with a Chicago area code I instantly recognized. It was Rebecca calling, after years of near silence, her voice strained and desperate in a way I had never heard before. "Matthew, it's Rebecca. I know we haven't really talked in a long time, but I need your help. We all do." Her voice cracked on the last words, so unlike the confident sister I remembered, that I immediately sat down, tension spreading across my shoulders. "What's going on?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral, despite the flood of conflicting emotions. "The business is collapsing," she said bluntly. "We're facing bankruptcy. Dad's investments are wiped out, and they might lose their retirement savings. I don't know what to do anymore." As Rebecca outlined the situation between shaky breaths, the picture became clearer. The ambitious expansion she had spearheaded, the very one funded by remortgaging my childhood home, had encountered multiple setbacks. Construction costs had skyrocketed beyond projections. One major client had backed out midway through a project, leaving them with a half-finished building and mounting expenses. Two others were withholding final payments due to quality concerns. "I thought I could handle it," Rebecca said, her voice small. "Everyone always told me I was so good at business, so naturally talented. But I've been drowning for years, taking on more debt to cover previous debts, hoping the next big project would save us." The irony wasn't lost on me. The golden child, admitting her gilded success, had been built on sand. For a moment, I felt a vindictive satisfaction quickly followed by guilt. This wasn't just about Rebecca. It affected my parents, their employees, and families who depended on the business for their livelihoods. "What about Mom and Dad? What are they saying?" I asked. Rebecca laughed bitterly. "Dad refuses to acknowledge how bad it is. Keeps saying it's just a temporary cash flow problem and blaming the economy, the city permit office, our suppliers. Everyone but us. Mom knows it's serious but defers to him. They won't listen to me anymore, not since the lakefront project fell apart." I pressed for specific numbers, my architectural business sense kicking in. The figures Rebecca reluctantly shared were staggering. Nearly $2 million in outstanding loans, tax liens pending, and their business credit stretched beyond recovery. The company my father had built over 30 years was weeks away from complete collapse. "I don't know what you expect me to do, Rebecca," I said finally. "I haven't been part of the business for years. They made it very clear they didn't value my input." "I know," she whispered. "I know how they treated you. I was part of it too, accepting all the attention and opportunities. I didn't realize until you were gone how unbalanced everything was." She paused before adding, "You were right about everything, Matthew. About the overexpansion, about the risks. You tried to warn us, and no one listened." After ending the call with a non-committal promise to think about the situation, I found Amanda in Lily's room reading our 4-year-old a bedtime story. The domestic scene, my wife's gentle voice, my daughter's sleepy questions, underscored everything I had built away from the toxicity of my family relationships. Why would I risk any of this by getting involved in their problems? "They're in serious trouble, aren't they?" Amanda asked after Lily had fallen asleep, the two of us sitting at our kitchen island with cups of tea. "Catastrophic trouble," I confirmed. "And frankly, it's trouble of their own making." Amanda studied my face carefully. "What are you thinking?" "Part of me wants to say it's not my problem," I admitted. "They created this mess by ignoring fundamentals, taking on too much risk, and frankly by dismissing my concerns years ago. Why should I step in now?" "And the other part," she prompted. "The other part remembers it's still the business my grandfather helped start. There are probably innocent employees who'll lose their livelihoods, and regardless of everything, they're still my family." We talked late into the night, weighing options and consequences. Amanda, always my moral compass, neither pushed me to help nor encouraged me to refuse. She simply asked the right questions to help me find my own answer. 3 days later, Rebecca called again. This time, her voice held raw panic. "Dad's in the hospital," she said without preamble. "His heart condition, the stress made it worse. He collapsed at a meeting with the bank yesterday." The news hit me harder than expected. Despite everything, the thought of my father physically vulnerable created a tightness in my chest I couldn't ignore. How serious is it? I asked. They're running tests, but the doctor mentioned possible surgery. Matthew, he keeps asking about the business, worrying about it even from his hospital bed. Mom's a wreck. I'm trying to hold everything together, but I'm failing at that too. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the decision I'd already made settling onto my shoulders. I'll fly out tomorrow, I said quietly. I need to see the situation firsthand before I can determine if or how I can help. After hanging up, I booked a flight to Chicago for the following morning. Amanda immediately began packing a bag for me, her actions signaling her support without words. Are you sure about this? She asked, finally zipping the suitcase closed. No, I answered honestly, but I need to at least assess the situation. If I walk away without even trying, I might always wonder if I could have made a difference. She nodded, then held my face between her hands. Just remember who you are now. Don't let them pull you back into old patterns. You're going to help them as the successful, confident man you've become, not as the son seeking approval. The next morning at SeaTac Airport, I hugged Lily tightly, promising to call every night for bedtime stories. As Amanda and I embraced before security, she whispered, "Remember, their emergency doesn't have to become your identity again." On the flight to Chicago, memories flooded back with each passing mile. Childhood birthdays overshadowed by Rebecca's achievements. College successes met with indifference. The final explosive argument before I left for Seattle. But alongside these painful recollections came newer, stronger ones. Amanda's unwavering support, Lily's unconditional love, my professional accomplishments earned entirely on my own merit. When the plane touched down at O'Hare, I texted Rebecca to let her know I'd arrived. Her response was immediate. "Thank you for coming. I'll pick you up curbside." As I waited at passenger pickup, watching the familiar Chicago skyline in the distance, I steeled myself for whatever came next. I wasn't returning as the forgotten son seeking validation. I was arriving as Matthew Wilson's successful architect and businessman who would assess this situation with professional clarity, regardless of the complicated emotions that had brought me here. Rebecca's car pulled up, and I barely recognized my sister as she stepped out. The polished, confident woman I remembered had been replaced by someone with dark circles under her eyes, unwashed hair, and clothes that looked slept in. When she saw me, her carefully maintained composure crumbled, and for the first time since we were children, Rebecca threw her arms around me and sobbed openly against my shoulder. The family home looked smaller than I remembered, its once pristine exterior showing signs of neglect, peeling paint on the trim, overgrown landscaping, a crack in the front walkway that hadn't been repaired. Rebecca parked in the driveway, her hands still shaking slightly on the steering wheel. "Mom's here," she said quietly. "Dad's still in the hospital, but they might release him tomorrow if his tests look good. I thought we should talk before seeing him." Walking through the front door felt like stepping into a time capsule. The furniture was the same, the family photos on the wall unchanged, including the notable absence of any recent pictures of me or my life in Seattle. My mother emerged from the kitchen, and I was struck by how much she had aged. Her hair had gone completely gray, and her posture had a defeated stoop I'd never associated with her. "Matthew," she said, her voice wavering, "you came." The awkward reunion was mercifully brief, with my mother quickly retreating to make coffee, her default response to uncomfortable situations. Rebecca led me to the dining room table where she had spread out financial documents, construction plans, and legal notices. "This is everything," she said, gesturing to the chaotic array of papers. "I've been trying to organize it all, but it's overwhelming." For the next 3 hours, I systematically worked through the documents, creating categories and timelines, identifying the most immediate threats and long-term liabilities. The picture that emerged was even worse than Rebecca had described on the phone. The company had overextended itself on multiple fronts, taking on projects beyond its experience level and financial capacity. Quality had suffered as they tried to cut costs, leading to client complaints and damaged reputation. Tax payments had been deferred, creating a significant liability with penalties accumulating daily. "How did it get this bad?" I asked, looking up from a particularly troubling bank notice threatening foreclosure on a property. Rebecca sank into a chair, running her hands through her hair. "It was gradual, then sudden. We'd take on a project that was slightly beyond our capacity stretch to make it work, then need an even bigger project to cover the shortfall from the previous one. Dad kept saying we just needed one big success to turn everything around. And you went along with it. I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. I tried to slow things down after the first year, she admitted, but by then, Dad had fully bought into the vision of becoming a major developer. When I expressed concerns, he would remind me how I had pushed for expansion in the first place. Eventually, I stopped raising alarms and just tried to manage the chaos. I was terrified of disappointing him, of being seen as a failure after years of being the successful one. My mother brought coffee, hovering anxiously at the edge of the conversation. "Is it as bad as Rebecca says?" she finally asked me directly. "It's worse," I replied honestly. "The business is essentially insolvent. You're facing multiple legal actions, and the outstanding debt is substantial. Dad's retirement accounts, mostly gone," my mother whispered, sinking into a chair. "He used them as collateral for one of the loans last year." I continued my assessment, visiting the company office the next day to review employee situations and current projects. The once bustling operation had dwindled to a skeleton crew of loyal employees who hadn't yet jumped ship. Walking through the workshop where I had spent countless childhood hours watching my father work, I felt a pang of grief for what had been lost. That afternoon, I finally visited my father in the hospital. He looked diminished in the hospital bed tubes, monitoring his weakened heart. When he saw me, a complex series of emotions crossed his face: surprise, shame, and something that might have been relief. "You didn't need to come all this way," he said, his voice lacking its usual authority. "Clearly I did," I replied, sitting in the chair beside his bed. "I've reviewed the business situation. It's dire, Dad." He looked away, staring out the window. "Just a rough patch. The market's tough right now." "This isn't about the market. This is about fundamental business mistakes. Overextension. Taking on projects beyond your expertise. Leveraging assets you couldn't afford to lose." My father's jaw tightened, the familiar stubbornness returning briefly before deflating. "You always were the cautious one." "I was the realistic one," I corrected. "And if you'd listened to me years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation in a hospital room." The confrontation I had anticipated didn't materialize. Instead, my father closed his eyes, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. "So you've come to say I told you so?" "No," I said after a moment. "I've come to see if there's anything worth saving." Later that evening, back at the family home, Rebecca finally broke down completely. Sitting at the kitchen table, where we had eaten countless family meals, she sobbed openly, all pretense of control abandoned. "I never wanted any of this," she confessed between ragged breaths. "I just wanted them to be proud of me. Every time they praised me for taking risks, for thinking big, I felt like I had to go even bigger the next time. I couldn't admit I was drowning, because being the successful daughter was my entire identity." "I know something about living up to their expectations," I said quietly. "The worst part," Rebecca continued, "is that I genuinely thought I was helping the company. I believed in what we were doing, but I was in over my head from the beginning, trying to implement business school theories without enough practical experience. By the time I realized how bad things were, my pride wouldn't let me admit it." My mother, who had been silently listening from the doorway, finally spoke. "We should have listened to Matthew years ago," she said, her voice barely audible. "We were so caught up in Rebecca's vision that we couldn't see the practical realities. That was always your strength, Matthew, seeing things as they really were, not just as we wanted them to be." The admission, coming years too late, landed with a bittersweet weight. The next morning, I met with the company's remaining management team, mostly longtime employees who had worked with my father for decades. Their loyalty was touching, but their fear was palpable as I outlined the severity of the situation. "Can it be saved?" asked Frank, the production manager, who had given me my first hammer when I was 10 years old. "I don't know yet," I answered honestly, "but continuing as you have been is not an option." When my father was released from the hospital 2 days later, I called a family meeting. Sitting in the living room where I had spent so many silent holidays in Rebecca's shadow, I laid out the reality without sugarcoating. "The business as it currently exists cannot be saved," I stated flatly. "The debt load is unsustainable. There are quality issues with recent projects that could lead to lawsuits, and your reputation in the industry has been damaged. You have three options: declare bankruptcy and walk away entirely, attempt a complete restructuring with significant downsizing, or sell off what assets remain to pay creditors and minimize personal liability. My father, still weak from his hospital stay, began to object, but I cut him off, something I had never done before. I'm not finished. If you want my help, which frankly might be your only chance to salvage anything from this situation, there are conditions. First, I need complete control over business decisions during the restructuring. Second, you both need to acknowledge that this crisis stems from poor management decisions, not external factors. And third, we need to have an honest conversation about the family dynamics that contributed to this situation. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, my father spoke, his voice lacking its usual certainty. And if we agree to your terms, what exactly would you do? I'll develop a restructuring plan, negotiate with creditors, and attempt to preserve the core business and the residential construction work that was always your strength. But I'll do it from Seattle, where my life and family are now. I won't uproot my life to fix a mess I warned you about years ago. My mother reached for my father's hand, squeezing it gently. Harold, we need to listen to him. We should have been listening all along. My father looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in decades. When did you become so authoritative? When I stopped waiting for your approval and started building my own life, I answered simply. Rebecca, who had been quietly crying throughout the conversation, finally spoke up. I'll work under Matthew's guidance. I'll learn what I should have learned properly from the beginning. I know I've lost everyone's trust, but I want to help fix what I helped break. I looked at my sister, seeing beyond the golden child facade to the insecure woman beneath, who had been crushed under the weight of impossible expectations. We'll see, I said, not unkindly. First, I need your commitment to complete transparency going forward. No more hiding problems until they're catastrophes. As the meeting concluded, my father struggled to his feet, his face conflicted with pride and humiliation. I built this company from nothing, he said, his voice breaking. The thought of losing it. I know, Dad, I replied, surprising myself, with the compassion in my voice. That's why I'm here. Not to punish you, but because, despite everything, I don't want to see your life's work completely destroyed. Before I left to return to my hotel, my father said something I had waited my entire life to hear. I was wrong about you, Matthew. I'm sorry it took this disaster for me to see it. It wasn't enough to heal decades of hurt, but it was a start. A crack in the wall that had separated us for so long. The next 6 months were among the most challenging of my life, balancing my successful Seattle business with the rescue operation in Chicago. I returned to Seattle after that initial week, having put together a preliminary restructuring plan and established daily video conferences with Rebecca and the remaining management team. Amanda welcomed me home with open arms, and no judgment, listening patiently as I described the complicated emotions of confronting my family's failures while trying to help them recover. I'm proud of you, she said that night as we lay in bed, Lily asleep down the hall. You found a way to help without sacrificing your boundaries. The restructuring plan was painful, but necessary. The company would return to its roots in residential construction, abandoning the high-end development projects that had caused so much trouble. 3 properties would be sold immediately to reduce debt, including an unfinished commercial building that had become a financial black hole. The staff was reduced by half, keeping only the most skilled and loyal employees. I arranged for the company's accounting to be handled by a professional firm, rather than my mother, who had been overwhelmed by the complexity as the business expanded. Most critically, I negotiated payment plans with creditors, leveraging my own professional reputation in some cases to buy the company time to stabilize. 2 months into the process, I flew my parents and Rebecca to Seattle for a weekend. It was time for the deeper conversation I had required as a condition of my help. Amanda suggested having the discussion at our home, where I would feel secure and centered. The contrast between my parents' struggling circumstances and our beautiful Seattle home was not lost on anyone. As they admired the craftsmanship of our renovated Craftsman house and the stunning view of Puget Sound, I saw my father taking in tangible evidence of my success achieved without any support from him. After dinner with Lily in bed, we gathered in the living room for the conversation that was decades overdue. I had suggested having Amanda present not as a shield, but as a witness to ensure old patterns didn't reassert themselves. Before we go any further with the business restructuring, we need to address the family dynamics that contributed to this situation I began. I'm not interested in blame or guilt, but in understanding, so we don't repeat these patterns. What followed was 3 hours of painful but necessary truth-telling. My mother cried as I described how it felt to have my achievements consistently overlooked. My father struggled to maintain his composure, as I recounted specific instances where his favoritism had been unmistakable. Rebecca acknowledged her role in accepting advantages at my expense, admitting she had sometimes deliberately drawn attention to herself when I was being recognized. I think I was afraid, she confessed, that if they started noticing you, they'd stop seeing me. The most surprising moment came when my father, who had been mostly quiet, finally spoke with unusual vulnerability. I saw myself in Rebecca, he admitted. Her charisma, her confidence, those were qualities I valued, because they were what helped me build the business from nothing. Your analytical mind, your attention to detail, your caution, those reminded me of my own father, who never took a risk in his life and worked for others until retirement. He looked at me directly, his eyes damp. I misunderstood what you were offering. I saw your caution as criticism, your attention to detail as nitpicking. I couldn't see that your skills were exactly what the business needed to balance Rebecca's vision. We're both deeply sorry, my mother added. Watching you here in this beautiful life you've built without our support makes our failure as parents even clearer. I didn't offer instant forgiveness. That would have been dishonest. Instead, I acknowledged their apology and suggested that rebuilding our relationship, like rebuilding the business, would take time and consistent effort. Over the following months, the restructuring plan began showing results. The streamlined company returned to profitability, albeit on a much smaller scale than its peak. Rebecca proved surprisingly adept at learning the fundamentals she had skipped in her rush to expansion, developing a newfound appreciation for the stable foundation my father had originally built. My father's health improved as the business stabilized and his stress decreased. He reluctantly accepted a reduced role as an advisor rather than primary decision-maker, focusing on mentoring the younger employees in construction techniques, something he genuinely enjoyed and excelled at. I made quarterly visits to Chicago, each trip less tense than the last. My parents made efforts to know Amanda and Lily, sending thoughtful gifts and making regular video calls. They hung photos of our Seattle life in their home and asked detailed questions about my architectural work, showing interest that felt genuine if belated. After a year of restructuring, the family business was stable enough to continue without my intensive oversight. We established a board of advisors that included an experienced construction industry consultant, a financial advisor, and me, in a limited capacity. Rebecca continued as operational manager, but with appropriate checks and balances. Most importantly, my relationship with my family transformed into something I had never thought possible. A relationship between adults who respected each other's strengths and acknowledged past mistakes without being defined by them. The old wounds didn't disappear entirely, but they no longer dominated every interaction. The most meaningful moment came when my parents visited Seattle for Lily's 6th birthday. My father pulled me aside after the party, as we stood watching the sunset over Puget Sound from our back deck. You know, I always thought success meant building something bigger than what came before, he said quietly. But I'm starting to understand that real success is building something better, whether that's a business, a relationship, or a life. He gestured toward Lily playing with Amanda in the garden. You've done that, Matthew. You've built something better. I thought about my grandfather, then about his quiet confidence in my abilities when no one else seemed to notice them. I had a good teacher, I replied. He just wasn't who I expected it to be. My father nodded, understanding the reference, without need for elaboration. We stood in companionable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to deep blue. Two men who had finally found a way to see each other clearly. Looking back on the journey from forgotten son to family savior, I realized the most valuable thing I gained wasn't vindication or even long-delayed recognition. It was the freedom to define success on my own terms, to build a life based on my values rather than someone else's expectations. The family business continues today, modest but stable, focused on quality residential construction rather than flashy development projects. Rebecca has found her authentic strength in client relationships and project management, unburdened by the pressure to be the golden child. My parents have settled into retirement, their financial security restored if somewhat reduced from their original plans. As for me, my architectural practice flourishes with a focus on sustainable design that combines innovation with practicality, the very balance I once tried to offer the family business. Amanda and I are expecting our second child, a son, and Lily has inherited my love of drawing buildings, covering our refrigerator with her designs. I've learned that true success isn't measured by who gets the most attention or praise. It's about building something meaningful, whether that's a business, a family, or your own sense of peace. And sometimes the people who once abandoned you might find their way back, but only if you found yourself first. If you've ever felt overlooked or undervalued by the people who should have been your biggest supporters, I hope my story helps you realize that your worth isn't determined by their recognition. Sometimes the greatest accomplishment is simply becoming the person you were meant to be, regardless of who notices. Thanks for listening to my story today. If you've ever dealt with family favoritism or had to rebuild a relationship that seemed broken beyond repair, I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe if this resonated with you, and share it with someone who might need to hear that being the forgotten child doesn't determine their future success. Until next time, this is Matthew reminding you that sometimes the strongest foundations are built after the first ones crumble.